Today we're going to look at Holy Communion. It's been a subject of a couple other videos, got into some of the theology stuff behind it and all that good stuff. But today we're just going to look at something a little more lighthearted. I don't want to say fluffy, but stuff that isn't quite so much of a heavy hitter, but still theological in nature. One of the questions that people come up with when they ask about Holy Communion, the bread and the wine, Anglican tradition, all that stuff, is, where does this bread and wine come from? What do we use? What do you use? Are there rules about this? And so that's a tricky one because a lot of people will have a very quick answer. Oh, yes, absolutely yes. There are definitely rules about this, about what kind of bread and wine and all that stuff. And it has to be this, this, and this. Blah, blah, blah. Here's our checklist. Other Anglicans will sort of look at you, go, oh, you know what? I don't think we have any rules. Come to think of it. Huh. So this is one of the interesting features of Anglicanism, I guess. And it's very consistent with our way of doing things in general. When you look at the actual rules, the rubrics, the instructions that are authoritative in the course of worship, we don't have a lot really spelled out for us regarding the bread and the wine. But in practice, we take a lot of cues from pre-existing tradition, which dictated how it worked in the medieval church and is generally pretty darn close to how the Roman Catholics continue to handle the logistics of Holy Communion to this day, and a number of other denominations as well. So the bread and the wine. Let's just take a quick note at the Roman practice, because this is where a lot of people take their cues from, either for the sake of convenience or by conviction. Their rules are that you have to have real bread and real wine. And if you just leave it at that, okay, we're on board. Pretty much any Christian can and should be on board with that. Jesus used bread and wine. He said, eat this, and he said, drink this. All right, so we're supposed to eat bread and drink wine. Got it. Easy. What the Roman Church then goes on to say is that bread is not real bread unless it's made of wheat, because that's the kind of bread Jesus had, I think. At least I think that's the argument. And so that runs into a bit of a problem, because there are other legitimate types of bread. There's barley bread, there's oat bread, there's rice bread. But are those indigenous to the Holy Land? I don't know. So anyway, the argument is that you have to have wheat bread with no additives. And so as a result, in Roman doctrine, there is no such thing as gluten-free communion bread. It's just not physically possible. They've figured out how to have an extraordinarily low gluten content for their communion bread, such that arguably even people with celiac disease shouldn't react to it, but it's still possible if it's severe enough, I think. It's one of those things you have to do your research on. But that's a rule that they're stuck with, for better or for worse. And in our case, well, there are other ways of making bread. And gluten-free bread is weird in concept, but it is real. And so, as far as most Anglicans are concerned, that is perfectly fine. That being said, most Anglicans, as far as I'm aware, at least in the United States, just buy communion bread wafers made by Roman Catholic companies because it's easier, it's more convenient. They're the ones who make it most of the time, and we just go for it. It's cheap, mass-produced, simple, done. Now, there's one exception to this that's really worth pointing out. It's that in the 1549 prayer book, our first prayer book, the rule stated was that it had to be bread that could be broken into pieces and distributed to the people. So that rules out the individual-sized wafers or hosts that was standard for communing the lay people back then, and is still standard in many, many churches today. That rubric didn't last, though. The individual wayfarers, I guess, were permitted to come back at some point. The main issue about breaking bread and giving out, personal-sized pieces of bread, is spillage and crumbs. You lose less material, and regardless of your particular theology of the real presence of Christ, there is something piously inappropriate about spilling crumbs on the floor or whatever. So you want to have a clean distribution of Holy Communion whenever possible. So that's perhaps one of the logistical reasons that the personal-sized pieces of bread are popular today, and we're no longer banned. But it's interesting because the original prayer book did say, no, it should be broken in pieces, and so the implication was to make a more normal sort of bread, as opposed to the churchy bread, which was the church special bread, which has evolved into the wafers that people know today. So that's an interesting thing. Technically, we can use any kind of bread. The main thing that stops most of us from using just any old bread off the shelf is, again, that of handling the crumbs and handling, the mess that it can make very easily. Plus, I guess it's a bit less hygienic too when you've got someone with a slice of bread and he's just sort of pulling pieces off and giving it to people. That could be the problem for hygiene, and cleanliness, it sort of escalates at that point. So that's a consideration. It's easier to just keep it clean with pre-made wafers. Now, that being said, something that I've come across in another church and adopted in my own practice is recovering the 1549 prayer book's rule about breaking bread, but still using wafers. Rather than buying what a friend of mine irreverently called the personal pan Jesus, the little individual wafer, we now get the next size up, the 4-inch wafers. So they break nicely into 4 or perhaps 8 pieces if you make it a little smaller. And that way, you just break that up and serve that to all the people, and now everyone gets a broken piece of bread. And the communication, the symbol that communicates of having a broken piece of bread in your hand that you receive in your mouth, or put in your mouth and eat, is more biblical. One of the whole points of what St. Paul is writing in 1 Corinthians 10 and 11 is that we are one body. Because we receive from one loaf, from one bread, we are one body. So it makes more sense to receive a broken piece because you are a broken piece. You are not the whole church. You are not the whole body of Christ on your own. You're a piece of it. You're one part, one member. So that's just sort of a neat, best of both worlds sort of mentality there. Now, communion wine. This is an interesting one. A friend of mine asked me about that. Like, you have I assume you have some special wine, right? I mean, you don't just buy it off the shelf or at the liquor store, right? We totally buy it from the liquor store. Yep, absolutely. I mean, I suppose there are some churches out there that do, where they have their own winemaker, I guess. And perhaps there are winemakers out there that dedicate their work out there just for wine for communion. I'm sure it exists somewhere. But in general, we just grab a wine and we pop the cork and use it. That's all behind the scenes, of course, where it's brought up in a flagon or a cruet usually. But anyway, there's a lot of discussion that you can find about if it should be white wine or red wine. The argument for white wine apparently is so that it does not look like blood, so that it doesn't, so people don't get hung up over the whole "is this blood" question. Other people say red wine is totally appropriate because it's consecrated to be the blood of Christ to us. So yes, it makes sense that it should visually match that which it's called to become or serve as, depending on your theology. So that's an interesting point. In Anglican practice, it has become very commonplace to use port, which is a fortified wine. Historically, it comes from Portugal. And the history behind that, I thought it was kind of amusing. So in the course of the Reformation, Great Britain was kind of cut off from trade in a couple instances. And so where does most of Europe's best wine come from? France and Spain. Very, very Roman countries in terms of religion. So they had to get wine from other farther away places, fortified wine, so it can travel farther, and more amiable trade partners like Portugal, apparently. So we have a history of using port as our communion wine. Now, I think that breaks the Roman rule because it's wine that has additives, that fortifies it, but what the heck? We're not Romans, so, go complain in a corner somewhere else. Anyway, so that's an interesting thing. We just happen to use port, a lot of us. Another tendency is just to use sweet, low alcohol content wine, like Manischewitz. So the joke there is that you'll get diabetes before you get drunk. But again, one of the questions that is related to is something that came up in the 1800s. Mr. Welch figured out how to make grape juice that did not ferment into wine. And this served really well the cause of certain Baptists and other Protestant groups who were increasingly unhappy about alcohol, and the whole temperance movement was getting together. So now you've got a situation today where most evangelicals use grape juice instead of wine. This is a clearer case, I think, of rewriting the ingredients for Holy Communion. If you think back to the Roman rules about, you have to use grape wine and you have to use wheat bread. Okay, well, there are other ways to make wine and bread. You can use other grains and you can ferment other fruit. But what if you don't ferment the juice? So it's not wine. It just isn't wine by definition. So that's a change in the species, as you call it, a change in the element. So it's no longer what Christ commanded us to drink. That being said, there are no Anglican pronouncements that officially declare grape juice unusable for Holy Communion, but that's mainly because the Anglican tradition was formed in an age before grape juice even existed, so this issue didn't have a chance to come up for us. Very, very few Anglicans use grape juice for Holy Communion. I've seen it used once or twice in an Anglican church as an alternative for wine, mainly for the sake of Baptist visitors, because it was like a wedding or something where a lot of non-Anglicans were in attendance, or where they're particularly concerned about the alcoholics or recovering alcoholics in their congregation. So that's a very interesting debate which can be explored in another time. I'm not going to go into all the details here. I'm just sort of outlining what's out there. And then the last thing I wanted to say about bread and wine that is just a matter of logistics with theology behind it is that of reservation. It's been a long-standing ancient practice to reserve consecrated bread and sometimes also consecrated wine. You'd put it in a very nice gold-colored box called a tabernacle, and you lock it up in there so it's safe, and then you bring it out to bring it to the sick. or the homebound. This is called reservation, and this practice was abolished during the English Reformation. But then it was unabolished, and certain rubrics and canons in the Church of England began to direct how to do it, and stuff like that. So the prayer book tradition that was enshrined by 1662 was that when you're bringing communion to the sick, what the priest actually does is have a very small communion service right there in the sick person's house. So there is no need for reservation according to that mentality and system. But it became more accepted and common practice eventually in many places to reserve some consecrated bread so that the priest or deacon can bring it to the homebound or the sick in the hospital and bring them Holy Communion. So that is the logistics there. The question of reverencing the consecrated elements was the main issue, I think, in the minds of the reformers. They didn't want people to kneel before the Blessed Sacrament and adore it, because there was a big concern that this was leading to idolatry. And with the nature of the sacrament and the meaning of real presence all under fire and in great debate, especially during the Reformation time, they figured that they were better off safe than sorry. So they completely abolished the reservation of the sacrament for a while. Now it's come back, and it's pretty normalized, not just among high churchmen, although there are still Anglicans out there who absolutely refuse to do so. But in general, it's an accepted practice, and it's reserved for the communing of the sick, or for saving it from Maundy Thursday to distribute to people on Good Friday. And that's related to the idea that there is no celebration of Holy Communion on Good Friday or Holy Saturday, because the liturgical focus of those days are the death of Christ. So we're not going to celebrate his resurrection for those 2 days of the year. Anyway, so that's a little bit about reservation of the sacrament, about the bread and the wine. You can hear more and more stories these days of churches where members of the congregation bake their own communion bread. That can be a positive thing. It's good for the mentality of the people offering their own alms and oblations with the bread and the wine, offering literally their own bread, or sometimes even their own wine, for Holy Communion. So that's a positive thing. But again, you have the question of crumbs and the logistics of keeping it clean and all that. So that, I think, is one of the main factors that holds that practice at bay from becoming the prevailing practice in our tradition, at least. So anyway, bread, wine, where it comes from, what it could be, what it can't be. There you go. Have fun with that.